For 37 years, the galaxy believed the Elorian queen could never be touched. Every healer failed. Every technology reached its limit. Then a human rescue soldier stepped across the barrier, not knowing her title, not seeking glory, only seeing someone who needed help. That single choice revealed a truth that would challenge an entire civilization and change the meaning of connection forever. Welcome to Gravity and Stardust. We wish you a wonderful viewing experience and a day filled with happiness. Now, let's begin this unforgettable story. For 37 years, the glass chamber had been the only place the Elorian queen could safely exist. It was not a prison. It was not a punishment. It was a solution created by a civilization that had run out of answers. Behind the transparent walls, Lyra Valen lived separated from the people she ruled. Every healer, every scientist, every machine had reached the same conclusion. Her body rejected Elorian neural resonance. Contact was not comfort. Contact was a threat. The galaxy knew the condition as resonance disorder. To Elorians, physical connection was more than touch. Their nervous systems carried a natural communication pattern that allowed emotions, biological signals, and social bonds to synchronize. For most of their species, it was a gift. For Lyra, it had become a wall between herself and everyone else. The Elorian Empire had spent centuries building around that wall. Medical protocols, royal traditions, security systems. Every solution protected the queen. Every solution also made the distance permanent. On the orbital medical station Asterion, blue diagnostic lights reflected across the silent chamber as thousands of calculations filled the air. Dr. Elian Voss stared at the latest neural analysis with tired eyes. 30 years of research surrounded him. Millions of data points. Endless simulations. Still, the answer remained beyond reach. Her resonance instability is increasing, one physician said quietly. Increase isolation parameters. Nobody argued. Isolation was the one thing they understood. Reduce contact. Reduce risk. Reduce the possibility of losing their queen. But nobody in the room said the other truth. Isolation was also the reason she had spent most of her life alone. The emergency doors opened before anyone could respond. Ethan Carter entered wearing a human rescue uniform marked with dust, repair patches, and the evidence of a mission that had not gone as planned. He was not a diplomat. He was not a scientist searching for recognition. He was a rescue soldier who had spent years entering places where people were running out of time. Dr. Voss immediately raised a hand. Stop there. Ethan stopped at the marked safety line. His eyes moved past the warning symbols and toward the medical chamber. What happened? The doctor hesitated. Most outsiders asked who was inside. Ethan asked what happened. The patient is experiencing neural collapse. Ethan looked at the floating medical data. Patient. Dr. Voss noticed the choice of word. Yes. Ethan studied the information instead of the person's status. Why can't you stabilize her? The doctor looked toward the glass chamber. Because every treatment requires interaction. Interaction triggers the condition. Ethan continued reading. So the system is protecting her from the thing needed to help her. Nobody answered. Because the sentence was simple. And because it was true. Human soldier, one researcher said. The Elorian medical community has studied this condition for centuries. Ethan nodded. I believe you. The response surprised them. He did not challenge their intelligence. He did not claim human methods were better. He simply looked at the problem differently. But you've been studying what happens after contact, Ethan said. Have you studied why contact causes the reaction? Dr. Voss looked at the data again. A small silence followed. Ethan noticed. He did not push. He already had his answer. Later, when the room emptied, he remained near the chamber reviewing the medical records. The numbers were precise. The research was impressive. The science was not wrong. It was incomplete. He had learned the difference years earlier on Europa Colony. A rescue mission. A failing structure. 12 minutes before evacuation protocol required withdrawal. He followed the order. The mission was recorded as successful. One technician never returned. Since then, Ethan understood something complicated. Rules mattered. Rules saved lives. But rules without judgment could leave someone behind. He looked through the glass again. The person inside was not an empire. Not a symbol. Not a historical figure. She was someone who needed help. Dr. Voss returned hours later. You have a proposal. Ethan nodded. A controlled observation. The doctor frowned. Contact. Only if every other option fails. And if it does fail? Ethan looked at the medical readings. Then we learned something. The physician studied him carefully. You say that as if failure is acceptable. Ethan shook his head. No. Failure is not acceptable. He looked toward Lyra. But pretending it cannot happen is worse. For the first time in decades, the Elorian medical team considered a possibility they had never tested. Not because they lacked knowledge, because they had never looked beyond the assumptions created by their own knowledge. And behind the glass, the queen who had spent her life protected from the universe was about to meet the one person who did not see a barrier. He saw a person waiting to be reached. The medical chamber remained silent after Ethan Carter presented his observation. Not because anyone agreed, because nobody had an immediate reason to dismiss it. For the first time in decades, the Elorian research team was looking at their own data from a different angle. The problem was not a lack of knowledge. It was the assumption built around that knowledge. Every previous study had started with the same conclusion. Contact caused harm. Therefore, contact had to be prevented. Ethan had asked a different question. Why did contact cause harm in the first place? Inside the analysis room, holographic models of Lyra Valen's neural system rotated above the central table. Dr. Elian Voss reviewed the information again, slower this time. The resonance pattern is specific, he said quietly. Not all physical interaction creates the reaction. Ethan stood across from him, studying the same model. So the body isn't rejecting contact. The doctor looked at the simulation. It is rejecting a signal. That sentence changed the room. Elorian scientists moved closer to the display. They had spent years measuring the reaction. Now they were examining the trigger. Lyra's condition was not a simple weakness. It was a biological defense mechanism designed around her species' own communication system. Elorians shared emotional and neurological information through resonance. Their bodies were built to recognize familiar patterns. The problem was that Lyra's system had become unable to distinguish between connection and danger. Ethan looked at the model. Then the question is whether another species creates the same signal. Dr. Voss did not answer immediately. He did not need to. The archive contained thousands of experiments. Elorian treatments. Elorian technology. Elorian biological studies. Almost everything had been based on one assumption. Their own species. We never tested external resonance compatibility, the doctor finally admitted. Ethan nodded. Not because you were careless. He looked around the room. Because nobody thought the question existed. The statement was uncomfortable because it was fair. No one in the chamber felt insulted. They felt challenged. There was a difference. Later, Ethan stood outside Lyra's medical barrier while the research team prepared a controlled observation. Every safety system remained active. Every measurement device was calibrated twice. The procedure was not a dramatic attempt to break a rule. It was a scientific attempt to understand one. Dr. Voss approached him before the test began. There is something you should know. Ethan looked up. What? If this fails, your own nervous system may experience a severe response. Ethan glanced at the warning display. Because her body attacks foreign resonance. Correct. He nodded slowly. And because humans don't produce that resonance, we don't know what happens. Dr. Voss studied him. You are calm. Ethan looked at the chamber. No, the answer surprised him. I'm not calm. He adjusted his glove. I'm just focused. That distinction was familiar to the Elorians. They had often mistaken controlled behavior for absence of emotion. Ethan was not fearless. He simply knew fear was information, not instruction. The procedure began. The chamber lights dimmed as the monitoring systems activated. Lyra remained unconscious, her breathing supported by medical equipment. Ethan approached slowly, not like a hero approaching an impossible challenge, like a rescue worker approaching an unknown environment. One step, one reading, one decision at a time. Contact point ready, Dr. Voss said. Ethan stopped beside the medical platform. For a brief moment, the entire room waited. Centuries of research, thousands of failed attempts, one unanswered question. Ethan reached forward and placed his hand against Lyra's wrist. The reaction came immediately. The monitors changed. Several warning indicators appeared. The physicians moved closer. Then they stopped. Because the expected collapse never happened. Lyra's neural system searched for a familiar resonance pattern. It found none. Instead of triggering a defensive response, her body remained uncertain. The machines recorded something Elorian science had never documented before. Neutral interaction. Dr. Voss stared at the readings. Impossible. Ethan watched the data. No, he looked at the screen. Just unknown. The distinction mattered. Nothing supernatural had happened. Nothing had been defeated. A biological difference had simply revealed a missing piece of understanding. For several minutes, Ethan remained beside Lyra while the medical team adjusted their models in real time. Her condition did not disappear. The resonance disorder remained, but her body was no longer fighting the contact. When the procedure ended, Ethan stepped back. He looked exhausted, relieved, not victorious. Dr. Voss noticed. You knew this might not work. Ethan nodded. Yes. Then why try? Ethan looked through the glass at Lyra. Because if nobody tests the possibility, then impossible becomes just another word for something we stopped investigating. Hours later, the Queen opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was not the empire that surrounded her, not the title she carried, not the barrier that had protected her for most of her life. She saw the human who had crossed it. And for the first time in 37 years, the distance between herself and another living being was no longer absolute. Lyra Valen opened her eyes expecting pain. For 37 years, that had been the first thing she associated with awareness. The sharp warning from her nervous system. The invisible rejection between her body and another living being. The reminder that even the people who loved her had to remain at a distance. But this time, there was only silence. The medical chamber lights moved slowly across the ceiling as her vision returned. The first sound she heard was the quiet rhythm of monitoring equipment. The second was a human voice. Her neural activity is stabilizing. Lyra turned her head slightly. A figure stood beside the medical console. A human, not an Elorian physician, not a royal advisor, not a member of her security detail. For several seconds, she simply watched him. Ethan Carter noticed her movement and stepped back, giving her space. The gesture was small, almost meaningless. Yet Lyra noticed. Everyone else always moved closer when she woke. They checked her condition. They examined the Queen. Ethan waited for the person. You are awake, he said. Lyra studied his face. Humans were familiar from historical records, but seeing one this close was different. Their features were similar to Elorians in many ways, but their expressions were different. Less controlled. More direct. Who are you? She asked. Ethan glanced at the medical display before answering. Ethan Carter. A pause. Rescue Division. Lyra looked toward the transparent barrier around her. Then back at him. You touched me. Ethan did not deny it. Yes. The answer was simple. Almost too simple. Do you know what happens when someone touches me? Ethan looked at the data. Now I do. Lyra noticed the wording. Not before. Now. You did not know who I was. Ethan looked back at her. No, you did not know I was the Queen. No. She searched his expression for hesitation. There was none. Not because he lacked respect. Because the information simply did not change the event that had already happened. Then why? She asked. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Because you needed help. The answer should have felt incomplete. Instead, it felt strangely honest. Lyra had spent decades hearing explanations. Political explanations. Medical explanations. Historical explanations. Everyone had a reason why the distance around her existed. But this human had crossed it before knowing whether there would be recognition afterward. Before knowing whether anyone would remember. Dr. Voss entered the chamber a few minutes later with a team of researchers. Their attention immediately shifted toward the data. The Queen noticed something unusual. They were no longer studying her condition with certainty. They were studying it with curiosity. The resonance model has changed, Dr. Voss said. Ethan looked at the screen. Changed how? The human contact did not interrupt the disorder. The doctor enlarged the neural pattern. It revealed the boundary of the disorder. Lyra listened carefully. For years, everyone had described her condition as a wall. Now they were describing it as a pattern. A difference. Something that could be understood. The distinction mattered. Later that day, the Imperial Council requested a full report. The request was expected. What happened next was not. They did not ask Ethan why he had touched the Queen. They asked why nobody had discovered this possibility before. The question spread through the medical community. Not as an accusation. As a challenge. Ethan remained outside the political discussion. He did not present himself as the answer. When one advisor suggested that human biology might represent a superior adaptation, Ethan immediately disagreed. No, the room became quiet. It's not better. He looked at the data. It's different. Lyra remembered that moment. A lesser person would have accepted the praise. Ethan rejected it. He refused to turn difference into superiority. That was when she began to understand what separated him from many others she had known. His confidence did not come from believing he had all the answers. It came from accepting how much he still had to learn. Over the following days, Ethan and Lyra continued working together. Not as a hero and a rescued queen. Not as a human and an alien. As two people standing on opposite sides of an unanswered question. Lyra challenged his assumptions. Ethan questioned hers. They disagreed often. That surprised her. For most of her life, people had either obeyed her or protected her. Very few people simply talked to her. One evening, she watched Ethan repair a damaged scanner from his rescue equipment. "You still maintain old technology," she said. Ethan looked at the device. "It still works. There are newer models." "I know. Then why keep it?" He tightened the final component. "Because something being old doesn't mean it has stopped being useful." Lyra looked at the repaired device, then at the glass wall separating her from the outside world. She wondered how many things in her own life had been labeled impossible simply because nobody had looked at them differently. And for the first time in 37 years, the queen behind the barrier began to consider a dangerous possibility. Maybe the wall had protected her, but maybe it had also prevented her from discovering what waited beyond it. The first weeks after the discovery were not filled with celebrations. They were filled with uncomfortable questions. Across Eloria, people wanted to know what the human soldier had changed. Some believed Ethan Carter had found the answer to a problem that had defeated their greatest minds. Others worried that his involvement represented something more dangerous: dependence. But inside the research division, Ethan refused to accept either idea. He had not solved the resonance disorder. He had only revealed that the question had been incomplete. The medical teams continued their work without turning him into the center of it. That decision mattered. The first stage of research focused on understanding the difference between Elorian and human nervous systems. The results confirmed what they suspected. Human biology did not overpower Elorian resonance. It simply operated without producing the same neural pattern. There was no immunity, no advantage, only difference. Dr. Elian Voss spent hours reviewing the new models. "For centuries, we believed the reaction came from physical contact itself," he said while studying the simulation. "We were wrong." Ethan looked at the display. "Not wrong." The doctor glanced at him. "You keep saying that." Ethan adjusted the medical interface. "Because it matters. If you call it failure, people will throw away everything that came before. Your research built the foundation. You just reached the edge of what it could explain." Dr. Voss remained silent. It was a very human way of looking at progress. Not a line between success and failure. A chain of attempts connected through time. Lyra observed these conversations carefully. She was beginning to understand that Ethan's greatest difference was not his biology. It was his relationship with uncertainty. He did not see unknown information as an enemy. He treated it as a place where investigation began. One afternoon, Lyra entered the research chamber without the full royal security formation. The guards remained nearby, but they no longer surrounded her completely. A small change, almost invisible. Ethan noticed immediately. "You're getting used to the new system." Lyra looked at him. "You mean the reduced security distance?" Ethan nodded. "Yes." She looked through the transparent wall separating the research area. "For most of my life, distance was considered protection." Ethan continued reviewing the medical data. Was it? The question was simple. It was also difficult. Lyra did not answer immediately. "It kept me alive." Ethan nodded. "That matters." She looked at him. "But..." Ethan placed the scanner down. "But something can protect you and still cost you something." The words remained with her, because she knew they were true. The barrier around her had never been created from cruelty. It was created from love, fear, and responsibility. That was what made it difficult to question. The most dangerous limitations were not always built by enemies. Sometimes they were built by people trying to do the right thing. Later, during the Imperial Council review, several advisors questioned the direction of the research program. "Our civilization has survived because we understand ourselves," one counselor said. "Opening our medical systems to outside influence creates uncertainty." Lyra listened without interruption. She understood their concern. A society that abandoned its own knowledge was not evolving. It was losing itself. When the discussion ended, she spoke. "We are not replacing Elorian knowledge. The chamber became silent. We are expanding it. One advisor looked toward Ethan. Because of the human? Lyra turned toward the holographic data. No, her answer was immediate. Because of the evidence. Ethan noticed the difference. She was no longer defending him. She was defending a principle. That was the moment he realized Lyra had changed. She was no longer a person waiting for someone else to open the door. She was choosing which doors deserved to remain closed and which ones needed to be opened. That evening, Ethan found her studying the original medical records from before his arrival. You still read the old files, he said. Lyra looked at the thousands of unsuccessful treatments. They are part of the truth. Ethan nodded. Most people only remember the solution. She looked at him. And humans remember the attempts. Ethan smiled slightly. Sometimes we remember the mistakes more clearly. Lyra looked back at the data. The galaxy had spent 37 years asking how to keep the Queen untouched. Perhaps the better question had always been different. Not how to maintain the barrier, but whether the barrier still served its purpose. And for the first time, Lyra was not afraid of the answer. The discovery did not change Eloria overnight. Real change rarely arrived like a sudden explosion. It arrived quietly, through meetings that lasted longer than expected, through researchers who stayed after their shifts ended, through people willing to admit that the answer they had protected for generations was incomplete. The resonance disorder remained. Lyra Valen was still an Elorian whose nervous system reacted differently from everyone around her. The difference was that her condition was no longer treated as an impossible mystery. It had become something that could be understood. Inside the joint research facility, human and Elorian scientists worked side by side. The first challenge was not creating a treatment. It was learning how to think together. Elorian medicine had been built on prediction. Before taking action, they calculated possibilities, mapped outcomes, and reduced uncertainty. Human emergency medicine operated differently. It relied on adaptation. Observe the situation. Make a decision. Adjust when reality changed. Neither approach was perfect. That was exactly why they needed each other. Your team changes variables too quickly, one Elorian researcher said, while reviewing a human diagnostic method. The human specialist looked at the simulation. And your team waits too long for conditions that may never exist. The room became quiet. Not because one side had won. Because both sides recognized a weakness in themselves. Ethan watched from the side of the laboratory. He did not interrupt. He had learned that cooperation was not about removing disagreement. It was about making disagreement useful. Lyra noticed that. She had spent her life surrounded by people who either followed her commands or protected her from danger. Ethan did neither. He questioned her. He listened to her. He treated her position with respect without allowing the title to replace the person. One evening, Lyra reviewed the latest research projections alone. The numbers were improving, but not dramatically. There was no perfect cure, no final answer, only gradual progress. Ethan entered the room carrying 2 data tablets. Still working, he asked. Lyra looked at the results. The progress is slower than expected. Ethan placed the tablets down. Is that bad? She looked at him. Most people would say yes. Ethan studied the medical charts. Most people usually compare progress to the ideal outcome. And you do not. He shook his head. I compare it to where we started. Lyra looked back at the first records. 37 years of isolation. Thousands of failed approaches. Then the first successful interaction. The first new data. The first possibility. The distance between impossible and possible was often measured in small steps. The next phase of research focused on developing an adaptive medical interface. Not a device that copied human biology. Not a replacement for Elorian technology. Something created between both systems. The interface monitored resonance changes while adjusting responses in real time. Elorian scientists provided precision. Human engineers provided flexibility. Together, they created something neither civilization could have built alone. During the first trial, the system detected a minor instability. The research team immediately stopped. Years earlier, the old approach would have considered the attempt a failure. Ethan looked at the data. Run the analysis again. One researcher hesitated. The trial did not complete. Ethan nodded. Correct. He pointed toward the results. But it gave us information. The researcher looked at him. You consider that success? Ethan shook his head. No, a pause. I consider it progress. Lyra heard the exchange and understood the difference. Humans did not celebrate failure. They simply refused to waste it. Later, She asked Ethan about that belief. Your species appears comfortable with imperfection. Ethan smiled slightly. Not comfortable. He looked toward the stars outside the station. Just familiar. Why? He thought about the question. Because reality doesn't wait until we're ready. The answer stayed with her. Eloria had spent centuries trying to remove uncertainty from existence. Humans had learned to move through it. Neither way was complete. But together, they created something new. Not a human solution imposed on an alien civilization. Not an Elorian system adjusted to accommodate outsiders. A shared method built from two different ways of surviving. And somewhere between prediction and adaptation, between tradition and change, Eloria began discovering the same truth Ethan had learned long ago. A better future was not created by finding the perfect answer. It was created by being willing to ask a better question. The success of the joint research program created something Eloria had not experienced in generations. Not a solution, a responsibility. For the first time, the Empire had evidence that its understanding of itself was incomplete. That realization created a quiet tension throughout the civilization. Some saw the discovery as an opportunity. Others saw it as a warning. The question was no longer whether humans could help. The question was whether Eloria could accept help without losing itself. Inside the Imperial Science Council, the debate continued for hours. The research data appeared above the chamber floor, showing the same conclusion from hundreds of different calculations. Human and Elorian methods produced better results together than either could achieve alone. But several council members remained uncertain. Our medical traditions have protected our people for centuries, Advisor Kalen said. Opening our systems to external influence creates a dependency we cannot easily reverse. Lyra Valen listened without interruption. Years earlier, she might have viewed the statement as resistance. Now she understood something different. Fear was often hidden inside reasonable concerns. You are correct, Lyra finally said. The council became silent. Nobody expected agreement. A civilization should not abandon its own knowledge. She looked at the research projections. But refusing new knowledge because it comes from outside is another form of weakness. Kalen studied her carefully. You believe the human approach is better? Lyra shook her head. No. Her answer came immediately. It is different. Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the chamber. He noticed the change in her voice. She was no longer defending him. She was defending a principle. The discovery did not belong to humanity. It did not belong to Eloria. It belonged to everyone willing to continue learning. After the meeting, Lyra walked through the old medical archives alone. The same records she had studied since childhood surrounded her. Thousands of attempts. Thousands of adjustments. Every generation had contributed something. The scientists who failed to solve her condition had not wasted their lives. They had created the path that eventually led to a better question. Ethan found her there hours later. You disappeared from the council reception. Lyra looked at the archive displays. I do not enjoy being celebrated for something unfinished. Ethan looked around the room. That might be the most human thing I've heard from you. She looked at him. Is that a compliment? I think so. A small silence followed. Then Lyra noticed the damaged rescue scanner in his hand. You still use that device? Ethan glanced down. Yes. The newer models are more efficient. I know. Then why keep repairing it? Ethan examined the old equipment. Because it still does the job. Lyra looked at the scanner, then at him. You value function over appearance. Ethan smiled slightly. Most rescue workers do. The answer seemed simple. But Lyra understood there was more beneath it. Ethan did not discard things because they carried history. He did not discard people either. The following months brought the first major clinical trials using the combined medical framework. The results were not perfect. Some patients improved quickly. Others required different approaches. The research team accepted that reality instead of forcing every case into one model. For Eloria, that was a cultural shift. They had spent centuries searching for universal solutions. Humans had reminded them that living systems were rarely universal. They were individual. During the final review of the new medical framework, Dr. Voss addressed both teams. The greatest mistake was not that we lacked knowledge. He looked at the human researchers beside him. The mistake was believing the knowledge we had was already complete. Nobody in the room considered the statement a defeat. It felt like progress. Later that evening, Lyra and Ethan stood near the station observation window. The planet below turned slowly beneath them. Your species accepts uncertainty differently, Lyra said. Ethan looked at the stars. We usually complain about it. Yet you continue. He nodded. Because reality does not wait for us to understand everything. Lyra considered that. For most of her life, uncertainty had been something to eliminate. Now she saw another possibility. Uncertainty could also be the space where discovery began. The barrier around her had once represented everything her civilization feared. Contact, change, the unknown. But now, the same unknown had become the reason two worlds were working together. And somewhere between Elorian precision and human adaptation, a new kind of strength emerged. Not the strength of being correct alone. The strength of knowing that sometimes the greatest discoveries began when someone was brave enough to admit they were missing something. The decision to continue the joint medical program changed the direction of Eloria, but it also created the most difficult challenge yet. Understanding a problem was easier than convincing an entire civilization to change the way it saw itself. The Imperial Council had accepted the evidence. They had approved the research. But approval was not the same as acceptance. Lyra Valen learned that during the first public review of the new medical framework, the chamber was filled with representatives from every major region of Eloria. Scientists, military leaders, cultural advisors, people who had spent their entire lives believing that distance was the foundation of safety. The projected data showed the progress clearly. Human-Elorian cooperation had created results that neither side could achieve alone. But the questions remained. How much influence are we allowing another species to have over our future? One council member asked. The question was not hostile. That made it more difficult. Lyra understood the concern because she had once shared it. Eloria had survived because it valued its own knowledge. Its traditions existed because previous generations had faced dangers and created solutions. Abandoning that history would not be progress. It would be carelessness. We are not replacing our knowledge, Lyra said. Her voice remained calm. We are testing its limits. A counselor looked toward the human standing near the observation area. And this began because of him. Ethan remained silent. Lyra noticed. Years earlier, she might have expected him to defend himself. Instead, he waited. He understood this decision belonged to Eloria. Not him. No, Lyra answered. It began because our knowledge reached a question we had not asked before. The room became quiet. That was the difference. Ethan had opened a possibility. But Lyra was the one deciding what that possibility meant. After the meeting, several advisors privately warned her. Your Majesty, history remembers leaders who protect stability. Lyra looked through the transparent walls of the Royal Archive, the same walls that had surrounded her medical chamber for decades. Stability without growth becomes stagnation. The advisor remained silent. But growth without respect for the past becomes destruction, Lyra continued. We need neither fear nor rejection. We need judgment. That evening, Ethan found her reviewing old records from before the discovery. Still studying the past? He asked. Lyra nodded. The future is built from it. Ethan looked at the archive. Most people only look forward after they find an answer. Lyra glanced at him. And you? He looked at the thousands of records. I think people who ignore how they got somewhere usually make the same mistakes again. She understood what he meant. The past was not a chain. It was a map. The next phase of reform began slowly. No dramatic transformation. No sudden removal of every tradition. Instead, small decisions accumulated. Medical training changed. Research teams became more diverse. Young scientists began studying both predictive Elorian models and adaptive human methods. The civilization was not becoming human. It was becoming more complete. But while Eloria changed, Ethan began preparing to leave. Lyra noticed the signs before he mentioned it. His equipment was organized. His rescue uniform was repaired. His reports were almost finished. You intend to return? She said. Ethan looked up. Yes. You could remain here. He shook his head. I could. The answer surprised her. Then why not? Ethan looked toward the research station where human and Elorian scientists continued working together. Because this was never supposed to depend on me. Lyra studied him. That was the lesson he had given Eloria from the beginning. A single person could start a change. But a future built around one person was another kind of barrier. You understand, she said quietly. Ethan looked at her. Understand what? That becoming a symbol can be another form of isolation. For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he nodded. Yeah. It was the first time Lyra saw him accept that truth about himself. The human who had crossed her barrier had one of his own. Before his departure, Lyra approved the final research agreement between Earth and Eloria. Her signature was not placed beside Ethan's name. It was placed beside thousands of scientists who would continue after both of them were gone. That was the real achievement. Not that one human had reached an untouchable queen, but that two civilizations had learned not to wait for one extraordinary person before choosing a better path. And as Ethan prepared to leave, Lyra realized something important. The greatest changes were not created when someone became powerful enough to break a wall. They were created when people learned why the wall existed in the first place. The day Ethan Carter left Eloria was not marked by ceremony. No military formation waited at the landing platform. No official announcement echoed through the orbital station. The moment was quieter than that. A human soldier stood beside a transport vessel, checking equipment that had already been checked twice. A damaged rescue scanner rested in his hand, the same one he had repaired countless times. Lyra Valen watched from a short distance away. For most of her life, distance had been something imposed on her, a necessary measurement between herself and the rest of the universe. But now she understood that not all distance was created for the same reason. Some distance protected, some distance prevented. Ethan finished securing his equipment and looked toward the station. The research teams continued working behind the glass walls. Human engineers, Elorian scientists, different languages, different methods, one shared purpose. Everything is ready, he said. Lyra nodded. You always say that before checking again. Ethan looked down at the scanner. A faint smile appeared. Because it usually isn't. It was a small joke. The kind of ordinary moment that would have been impossible months earlier. Back then, every interaction between them carried the weight of history. A queen, a human, a medical mystery. Now, they were simply two people saying goodbye. You could remain here, Lyra said. Ethan looked at her. The invitation was sincere. Not political, not strategic. I know. Then why leave? He looked toward the planet below. Because this place doesn't need me anymore. Lyra studied his answer carefully. That is not true. Ethan waited. The research changed because you were here. He nodded. Maybe. A pause. But if everything stops when I leave, then we didn't build anything. We just created another dependency. Lyra understood immediately. It was the same principle he had shown from the beginning. He had never wanted to become the solution. He wanted people to discover one together. That realization stayed with her because it reflected something she had struggled with for years. Her own identity had been shaped by being necessary. The queen who had to be protected. The person whose condition required special treatment. The symbol everyone depended on. Ethan had shown her another possibility. A person could matter without becoming a burden others carried. Before his departure, Lyra gave him the final version of the adaptive medical interface. The device was no longer experimental. It had become part of the shared research platform between Earth and Eloria. This belongs with the archive, Ethan said when he saw it. Lyra shook her head. No, she placed it in his hands. It belongs with the person who proved the question existed. Ethan looked uncomfortable. That sounds dangerously close to giving me credit. It is not credit. Lyra looked at the interface. It is history. The distinction made him pause. He accepted recognition differently now, not as proof of his importance, as evidence of what many people could accomplish together. There is something I learned from you, Lyra said. Ethan looked surprised. From me? Yes. She glanced toward the station windows. I believe protection meant removing every possible risk. Ethan remained quiet. You showed me that sometimes protection also requires allowing people the freedom to face uncertainty. He looked at her. That sounds more Elorian than human. A small smile appeared on her face. Perhaps we are both changing. The transport countdown began. The sound echoed softly through the departure chamber. Neither of them moved immediately. There were many things they could have said. Gratitude, respect, friendship, but neither needed to name them. Some things became clearer when left unspoken. Ethan stepped toward the vessel, then stopped. He turned back. Lyra. It was the first time he had said her name without a title attached. She noticed. So did he. Yes. He looked at the transparent wall behind her. The barrier that had defined her life for so long. Make sure nobody builds another one without asking why. Lyra looked at the glass. Years ago, she would have seen only protection. Now she saw a choice. I will. The transport doors closed. As the vessel departed, Lyra remained in the observation area. She watched the human ship disappear into the stars, carrying no weapon, no conquest, no demand for recognition. Only a lesson. Change did not belong to the person who started it. It belonged to everyone brave enough to continue it. And somewhere between a queen who learned to step beyond her barrier and a soldier who learned he did not have to carry every burden alone, two civilizations discovered the same truth. Connection was never created by removing all differences. It was created when two different beings chose to understand each other anyway. 7 years after the first contact between Ethan Carter and Lyra Valen, the galaxy no longer remembered the event as a medical breakthrough. The official records described it differently. A change in scientific cooperation. A new era of interspecies research. A moment when two civilizations expanded their understanding of biology. But Lyra remembered something smaller. She remembered a quiet medical chamber. A human soldier standing beside a bed. And the first person who looked at her without seeing a title, a problem, or a symbol. The adaptive medical interface created from their shared research had become standard equipment across several worlds. It did not eliminate every condition. It did not create perfect health. It did something more realistic. It allowed doctors to understand patients as individuals instead of forcing every life into the same solution. That philosophy spread beyond medicine. Elorian institutions slowly changed. Not because they rejected their traditions, because they learned traditions were meant to guide people, not replace their judgment. Lyra remained queen of Eloria, but the way she carried the role was different. She no longer appeared behind layers of separation during public events. She still respected safety protocols. She still listened to experts. But she no longer confused protection with isolation. The first time she entered a public medical facility without the old transparent barriers surrounding her, many citizens expected a speech. Instead, she walked through the building and stopped beside the research teams who had continued the work after Ethan left. Human scientists stood beside Elorian researchers. Young specialists stood beside those who had spent decades searching for answers. The Queen did not stand above them. She stood with them. Years later, Ethan received a message from Eloria while preparing for another rescue assignment near the outer colonies. The message contained no formal request, no diplomatic language, only a simple update from Lyra. The latest research center had completed another successful adaptation trial. A young Elorian patient who once would have lived behind permanent medical restrictions had gained a safer, more independent life. Ethan read the report twice. Then he closed it and returned to repairing his equipment. Some things never changed. Lyra noticed that when they spoke again. "You still repair old tools," she said through the communication channel. Ethan looked at the worn scanner on his desk. "It still works. There are newer models." "I know." She smiled slightly. "You have not changed completely." Ethan looked at the stars outside the transport window. "Neither have you." A pause followed. "That is not true," Lyra said. Ethan looked back at the screen. "No. No," her voice softened. "I changed because I learned I was not only what others needed me to be." Ethan remained quiet. He understood the meaning behind the words. Years earlier, he had carried the belief that his value came from being the person who arrived when everyone else could not. Lyra had helped him understand something he had never considered. A person was not measured only by the emergencies they survived. Sometimes strength meant allowing others to stand beside you. "You know," Ethan said, "for someone who spent years behind a barrier, you became very good at removing them." Lyra looked toward the stars beyond Eloria. "And for someone who crossed one, you spent years building another." Ethan smiled faintly. She was right. The realization no longer felt like a wound. It felt like something understood. Their final conversation ended without dramatic promises. Neither of them knew what challenges waited ahead. Both civilizations would still disagree. Both would still make mistakes. Progress had never meant perfection. It meant the willingness to continue learning. On Eloria, Lyra eventually visited the original medical chamber where she had spent most of her life. The glass walls remained. The room had become a historical archive. She placed her hand against the surface and stood there quietly. The barrier that once represented everything she could not have was now a reminder of everything that had changed. Not because someone destroyed it, because someone asked why it existed. Outside the chamber, stars reflected across the glass. The same stars that had watched a human and an alien queen discover that distance was not the space between two worlds. It was the moment when one chose not to reach out. And sometimes, the future of an entire galaxy began with one simple decision. Someone reached out. Someone else chose to take their hand. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this journey among the stars. We hope this story brought you a moment of wonder and reflection. Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, and subscribe to Gravity and Stardust for more unforgettable cinematic sci-fi tales waiting to be discovered.